Okay, welcome to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. I could use some white lightning on my brain right now because I'm tired, and I'm going to be talking about Charles Murray's Coming Apart, which is quite thick.
All right. I wanted to make a comment about what we talked about last time with the high blood pressure, because it kept bothering me after the conversation. It's just the simple idea that not only a doctor, but a cardiologist specifically does not understand the effects of exercise and diet on the cardiovascular system. Let everybody let that sink in. A cardiologist did not understand the positive effects of exercise and what was safe and what wasn't in his own field. There's a problem there. There's a big problem there. And part of it is the problem that we accept the appeal to expert as the end all be all argument. They're the expert. Listen to them. Don't listen to anybody else, even though the literature is far and away the opposite direction. In fact, the only reason I had to do any research was because I wanted up to date literature to put forward versus where I had to research this 12 years ago, 13 years ago, when I was getting into the industry. So this is something that was known over a decade ago, and a current cardiologist does not understand it. That makes me sad.
Well, it's just one more of the innumerable examples of how people get into bubbles. I mean, because he's in a bubble of his own industry and literature, and it has not been pierced by all this other data, even though, like you say, it's out there. It's been out there.
Well, that was my initial knee-jerk reaction, but I can't even give the bubble benefit of the doubt here because it's what he does.
Yeah.
He should know everything about that system, or at least the most common things of that system, which I guarantee you his most common patient is high blood pressure.
Well, I think the problem with the bubble is that when we're in our bubbles, we don't go outside. We never recognize that we are in one. It doesn't exist unless we sit there passively, and it only exists if it comes into our bubble. We never pierce it ourselves and go looking outside. So if while he's just sitting there passively, this data comes along somehow, somebody from within pulls it in so that he can see it, then he'd probably go, oh, wow, interesting, and change his mind, but he's not going to go looking for it.
I guess to broaden it out though, why is it not continuing education industry standard that this is part of their education going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the criticisms I oft hear, especially of late, that we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's not a lot of emphasis and concern with prolonged health and preventative stuff. It's the healthcare system doesn't really, concern itself until you get to the point of, all right, well, time for a lap band surgery. All right, time for some, diabetes medicine, time for some high blood pressure medicine. Okay, that's where it kicks in. And that's part of that bubble. They're in that bubble of sick care rather than healthcare, and there are very few that are proactively piercing that bubble and going out to say, let's bring in some of this other stuff so that we don't get to that point of time for some lap band surgery.
And I think another thing that you can include in that is the fact that it's a numbers. It's a kind of a mill now. It's an assembly line, one patient after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. They don't spend time talking to you. They don't spend time getting to know you. The old days, the scientist of the town was the doctor. And how many diseases have been identified and treatment to them progressed because that doctor showed up at the home and looked at their environment, looked at the person. What was it, cholera? That the outside doctor came to the city and he noticed that he just had made the observation that all these patients were on the same waterway,
Yep.
getting their water supply. So that observational data that doesn't come in a little 5 minute. All right, here's your AKG. You have high blood pressure and you have an arrhythmia. Here's your treatment. Take this medicine, go to this doctor for your ablation. And boom, done. Next patient.
Yeah. No, that's why I've stuck with the pain management doctor I've had for so long, because he does do that. From the beginning, it was, all right, let's sit down and let's figure this out. And it was, all right, well, we can try this, but it may do this, it may do that, but it'll give us some data. And then it's, all right, let's figure out why this complicated problem is so complicated.
I just wanted to do a short little rant on that before we got onto your subject matter, just because it was weighing down on me.
Yep. Okay. Well, I have no idea how to transition to that.
Well, just hard stop and transition.
Hard stop and transition.
Pivot.
Okay. So I'm going to go through just kind of try and give a broad outline of what he defines as the new upper class. The broad elite is one of the terms he uses for it. And then the white lower class as he defines it. And then I'll go into what he looks at as the causes, the markers that indicate why that lower class exists and what to do about it. So if you have anything while I'm laying out the outline here, just jump in, but otherwise I'm just going to try and get through it quickly.
Okay.
So we can spend most of our time on the other bit. So the broad elite he defines as well, let me just read here. I hereby operationally define the new upper class as the most successful 5% of adults ages 25 and older who are working in managerial positions in the professions, medicine, the law, engineering, and architecture, the sciences, and university faculty, and in content production jobs in the media. As of 2010, about 23% of all employed persons ages 25 or older were in these occupations, which means about 1.5 million people constitute this top 5% that he's talking about.
And say that number again, 23% of
all employed persons ages 25 and older were in these occupations, meaning a little under 1.5 million people. And so one of the things I like about this and why I want to spend a whole segment on its own talking about the new upper class is because it's not just about income. It's not, those 1%ers make more money than I do. It's like it says, these are people in managerial positions. These are content. These are people who generate and direct the content in media. This is university faculty. So these are people that are in positions of power to drive, culture and perception. So it's more than just income. And something else he spends some time on is the fact that so many of these people come from the same bubble. Okay, they come from the more elite universities, and they've all gone kind of on that same track of they came from upper middle class neighborhoods. They went to the same kinds of universities to study the same kinds of things, and so they have created their own subculture basically. So that's who he defines. That's how he defines the upper class. Now, for some historical context of why it matters, is that
let me interject something here, since you're about to move kind of onto a little bit different uh, direction. Uh, Kind of marrying this with his other book that I read, and I don't know if he explicitly says it in there, but that would be also affected by the fact that now you're talking about the broad elite being about such and such percent of the population, only 1.5 million people out of the 330 million. How many, I don't know how many of us are adults in this country.
Yeah.
It'd be more than half. Uh, so when we talk about the bell curves of ability, now we're actually being more represented in the tails than we are in the mean. So a small difference in the mean is going to be uh, exaggerated in the tails. So when we're looking at representation, now we're in a totally different dynamic than looking at just the averages.
Yeah.
So that's another thing to include in why some of the numbers are probably the way they are.
Right. And because if he does spend some time with some people who came before him and wrote about this of basically the knowledge economy or the brain economy, there's some different terms for it of how it's um, economic income and power and position is more and more shifting away from the entrepreneurial and the crafts with the dirty jobs people. Even though as Micro says, the dirty little secret of dirty jobs is that most of the people you see on that show were self-made millionaires. They had built companies that made a lot of money. They were just still literally working in shit because it paid, and that was their job. But the elite has moved away from that and into the more brain power focused jobs and part of the economy. But one of the great things about America historically is that we have been a classless society. That's not to say there weren't poor people. That's not to say there weren't rich people. The point is, nobody viewed themselves that way. As he puts it, for most of its history, working class America was America for practical purposes. In 1900, 90% of American workers were employed in low-level white-collar or technical jobs, manual and service jobs, or worked on farms. Even when our time horizon opens in 1960, 81% of workers were still employed in those jobs. Within that mass of the working population, there were racial and ethnic distinctions, but not many others. Blah, 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 blah. So one of the works he builds off of is Michael Harrington's The Other America, which was one of these books that came out around 1960, in the early 1960s, that kind of led to the Great Society and the War on Poverty. It was one of these early works saying, hey, we have poverty in America and it's bad, and we need to do something about it. And he says one of the reasons The Other America created a stir when it was published in 1962, partly because Harrington said America's poor constituted a class separate from the working class, a daring proposition. At that time, the poor were not seen as a class either by other Americans or in their own eyes. The poor were working class people who didn't make much money. But the important point is that you were still expected to participate in the institutions of American culture. Okay, so even if you were poor, you still went to a church. You still participated in a service organization. You still participated in your children's school. You still did those neighborhood kind of things. It didn't matter whether you were poor, middle, or rich. Everyone kind of participated in those classic institutions. And now I'm gonna, well, let me finish here. So why it matters, why he's looking at this new lower class that's growing, and the way he looks at it. So he establishes that this is kind of his prologue to the part two about the new lower class is the separation of the new lower class from the norms of traditional America would be interesting but not alarming if it represented nothing more than an alternative ways of living that work equally as well as the old ways of living. The nation is not going to the dogs because people wear jeans to church, smoke marijuana, or pierce a wider variety of body parts than their parents did. But the separation of the classes described in part two does not consist of these kinds of differences. Rather, it comprises differences that affect the ability of people to live satisfying lives, the ability of communities to function as communities, and the ability of America to survive as America. And so I want to kind of put a pin in that, because the main thing I'm curious how you're going to react is the four things that he focuses on as degrading virtues that are why the new lower class can't live satisfying lives and that community is kind of falling apart. But before I do that, as the final part of this outline of what he's talking about, I want to jump to the end to lay out the size of the new lower class as he sees it. So he looks at these various categories of the way he figures the new lower class size is he looks at what he calls three problematic categories: men who aren't making a living, and he defines making a living as earning an income large enough that it puts a household of two above the poverty line.
And that's just the male.
Mm-hmm.
So a man who can support the whole family is what he's talking about.
Yeah, a man who can. Well, he addresses that a little later and says this is a very low bar because, you know, ideally you would want more because the head of a household, if he's got a family, he's going to need more. But at a bare minimum, you need to be able to have a two-person household over the poverty line. And he gives the numbers of how that's not that hard.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm trying to just differentiate here. Is it one person getting them over the poverty line, or is it a combined income getting them over the
No,
poverty
it's not
line?
a combined income.
Okay.
It's and it'll make sense why he's looking about that when I go into the virtues that he looks at. Because he gives the numbers that, so for instance, in, I think his numbers are 2010 here, only 6% of hourly jobs paid the minimum wage in 2010. So the overwhelming majority paid more than the minimum wage. So in 2010, the average janitor made $11.60 an hour, which at the time was above the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
well, it's still above the minimum wage, isn't it?
I can't remember if
it hasn't
was
changed
raised
much
or not.
I think the only good argument for a raise of that is that it hasn't changed in a long time. But
yeah. So as he puts it, if you were a janitor working a 40-hour week, then you would have passed his line. You would pass that poverty line in the 31st week of the year. So not that hard. Single women with children, which he sees as a problem, and pretty much all sociologists and demographers see as a problem, as we've talked about ad nauseum. And then what he calls isolates, community isolates. So men who are making a living and women who are not single mothers but are disconnected from the matrix of community life. So, and the way he figures this up is through a number of sociology surveys, and he looks at the number of adults who do not belong to any civic organization whatsoever. So and attend church no more than once per year.
Are we going to go into more detail after you list them, or are we going to just discuss them in detail as you're going?
No, I'm just telling you how he gets the number I'm about to give you.
Okay. Because the speculation on that is they because of their low income, they don't have time to.
No, that's separate. These are separate categories.
Okay.
So this is outside of those first two categories. Then the final category he looks at are people who belong to no community organization or do not attend church more than once a year. Because he's considering church a community organization. So,
okay. So what was the second one then? Because I was looking up a number for you when you. So it's men who aren't making a living.
Single mothers.
Single mothers. Okay. All right. Okay.
And so when he adds up all those categories, the percentage who qualified for the white new lower class more than doubled from 8% at its low in the late 1960s to 17% in 2007. In 2009, a year into the recession, that percentage had passed 19% and probably passed 20% in 2010, which the book was published in, I think, 2012. So 2010 was his last data year, basically. So you're looking at close to 20% for what he's calling the new white lower class, which is a significant chunk of the population, especially when you consider that for the longest time, as he said, not looking at income, because you were not lower class if you were working class. You just were working class. You were a working stiff who didn't make much money. Mm-hmm. That all of these people that, as he pointed out in that historical context section, is that all of these people considered themselves working stiffs. Whether they were a clerk or whether they were on an assembly line, they were all punching a clock. They were all working stiffs. So people who would truly be considered lower class, the kind of marginalized people on the outskirts of civic life and culture, would be less than 10%. Anyway, so that's the foundation. Those are the numbers that he's looking at. Did you have any thoughts on that before I give you what the main section of the book talks about?
Yeah, just in case it doesn't touch on it, I wanted to bring current numbers because you brought up 2010 mm-hmm. was 6.6% of hourly workers. Mm-hmm. Well, apparently we made progress. Let me share the screen here. This is a Bureau of Labor statistics. So as of 2020, it's only 1.5% make the federal at or below the federal minimum wage. And where I wanted to kind of go with that too is if we look at the breakdown of the workforce, 4,695,000 of those, of the actual wage workers, the 73 million, were age 16 to 19. So it's a quarter of the number of age 16 to 19-year-olds that actually make minimum wage. And I bet you the bulk would be in that
1.5% of all hourly workers, only 1.5% of all hourly workers make minimum wage, but a quarter of all 16 and 19-year-olds make minimum wage.
Gee, well, no, if you would say if you make the assumption as with any mathematical model that most minimum wage workers are those ages 16 to 19, which obviously is not true because you do have unskilled labor as people get older as well. But even still, so when you're breaking down the data, when we're talking about what's a big problem in the United States of America, these numbers kind of actually make it seem, well, maybe this isn't the biggest issue we have in front of the table. Why is it one of the top 5 national issues on the plate when we're talking about our federal policy?
All right, the founding virtues. So the biggest chunk of the book, the middle chunk of the book, where he where he lays out basically what he sees as the problem and shows the numbers of these of the radically declining numbers in these virtues are marriage, industriousness, honesty, and religiosity. And the reason he focuses on these are, so one, because from a sociologist point of view, that these are qualities which lead to happy and healthy adult life, basically. Okay, the reason he calls them founding virtues is because these were all things that were talked about ad nauseum by the founders and around the founders. He also cites a number of foreign observers who, like Alexis de Tocqueville and some others who came to America and wrote about America and what made America different from Europe. Something he lays out that I'm glad he does is, because of America's strong Christian heritage, people have this misapprehension that America was full of prudes and Puritans. One of the most shocking things to Europeans about America was hygiene and manners. We were a very ill-mannered people who did not take hygiene. It was not high on our list of things. Spitting, the amount of spitting in public appalled Europeans. When he goes into
I'll make a personal anecdote that kind of will highlight that a little bit. Not only is it appalling that we did it so much, it's actually one of the bigger insults you could do on the other side of the pond. We were in Austria at the Goulash Warehouse having our dinner, and a French family came into this place, and they it was loosely translated for me. They were talking about how horrible the place was and how dirty it was and how it smelled and it wasn't up to their standards. And the owner chased them out. He chased them out, screaming in German at them, and he spit on the ground behind their heels, and they were like, oh my, ooh. And they spit on the ground in front of him and left. It was like, yeah. It's so disgusting to them that it's one of the worst things you could it's like us flipping the bird, or along those lines. Did I ruin your train of thought?
No, I was just looking for one of my favorite quotes here. One of these foreign observers found that Americans were, quote, astonished that one should object to sleeping 2 or 3 in the same bed and in dirty sheets, or to drink from the same dirty glass after half a score of others. All foreign observers agreed that the amount of spitting everywhere, indoors and out, was disgusting. The point being that these virtues that he's talking about are not these kind of superficial things that people think of when it comes to the virtues of founding America and early America. This wasn't about manners. This wasn't prudish Puritanism. It was something deeper than that.
Well, I can give you part of it, which is what we talked about not that long ago with the individualist explorer versus the communal person who stays conservative, basically. Well, a lot of that is linked to just the natural gut reaction of disgust. What is disgusting to one person can actually translate into your social habits over the course of history. And the fact that we were of this certain type that came over here, probably it's self-selected for the most less prone to discuss, which is also why we probably made such a great melting pot, because a lot of xenophobia is connected to that same gut reaction. You hear the dirty foreigners or the dirty people crossing the border. That's the xenophobic kind of ideal, and it's directly linked to disgust versus pure tribalism. But yeah, that we probably self-selected it at a rapid rate because it took a lot to cross that ocean back then.
Yeah. Well, and something people don't consider a lot is that even during the biggest waves of immigration to America, there was a lot of immigration out that if you couldn't make it, you went back. If you couldn't make it for whatever reason, you went back, and a lot of people did. Obviously the net was a net gain big time, but a lot of people did go back because for one reason or another, as you say, we were self-selecting, and they self-selected of no, I don't like it here for one of these reasons. So industriousness is the first virtue he looks at. And it was something that the founders talked about constantly. They use the term industry. To us, that means something different. That's why he uses industriousness, because what he's talking about
more the mental and physical trait versus the machine that is what's usually developed by that.
Exactly. And the reason it's important and what it meant at the time is to them, industry signified a cluster of qualities that had motivated the revolution in the first place. A desire not just to be free to speak one's own mind, practice religion as one saw fit, and to be taxed only with representation, but the bone deep American assumption that life is to be spent getting ahead through hard work, making a better life for oneself and one's children. And so that's why he's using at the end of the book, when he's calculating up the size of the new lower class, that's one of the reasons he looks at men who aren't making a living, is that to him that's the way to quantify this virtue of industriousness, that if you're not able to make a living, at that bare minimum, if you're not able to do that bare minimum, then that's a problem, and that is lacking in this virtue. Honesty. So this is something that this is something that is amusing to quantify, and he ties into the foreign observations, is that one of the things that struck foreigners was the manners and the hygiene and the uncouth way that Americans lived and acted. And yet honesty was one of their highest virtues. Their word was their bond. George Washington is held up. I don't know if they even still do in elementary school, but the fairy tale basically of the cherry tree, and that he cannot tell a lie. It was a big deal to him. And to a lot of the founders.
Well, even on the evolutionary note, in his section on honor cultures, you would expect him to talk about the Japanese or something along those lines. His big example is the American South. It was, the word was their bond. It was the you disgrace my family, I'm going to kill you. You question my honor, I'm going to kill you. And the amount of duels is not something we talk about in American history very often, but the amount of duels in the American South was way out of hand, to the fact that, to the extent they had to create policy to try to get it down to a reasonable level. So
and he uses crime data to kind of try and quantify this. And so one of the amusing things he points out is it's a little bit difficult to guesstimate crime data because it wasn't kept all that well, but also because serious physical altercations were a way of life in early America. Things that we would consider aggravated assault was simply a fight that would often, as the European observers pointed out, draw crowds, and people would watch what would today be considered aggravated assault, but then was a mutual fight, and it could get ugly and bloody, but then it was done, and the two parties parted ways.
Mm-hmm. Whereas nowadays you go out to the club or to, the bar or whatever, and someone wants to start something, you just got to look at them and be like, it's not that I don't have that same little impulse of an alpha male here, but you do realize we're both going to go to jail. They're not going to say, oh, they got in a fight, they're parting ways. No.
So some of the earliest data he could find that was well calculated was a populous part of Massachusetts just outside of Boston, where records were kept between 1760 and 1810, and showed that the annual number of prosecutions for theft averaged 2.7 per 10,000 of the population. So a very low number. Marriage. So something interesting that would probably surprise a lot of people is how, and foreign observers commented on this, is how egalitarian marriage was in early American life. Now, people will think that's odd, but the European way was arranged marriages, and we think of it as simply, the aristocracy creating marriage alliances and whatnot. Marriages were arranged, all the way down to the poorest people. That your parents would get with other parents, and they would figure out who's matching with who. Courtship was something that came much later to European life, but started pretty much
so much so that
life.
It was so much the exception of the rule that it made for a book or an epic story when the courtship happened in the face of the arranged portion.
Yeah. And in America, courtship was the norm, and it was the man who did the pursuing, but it was the woman who had the final say, which again was very unique to America. This is where I think the right has one of its big failures is the term American exceptionalism, and what that means. We're not exceptional because we're richer and more powerful than anyone else. We're exceptional because we have all of these things, these founding virtues that were the exception to the rule at the time. And one of those exceptions was that marriages were not arranged and the woman had the final say. So you could pursue all you want, but ultimately you were trying to win the hand of the woman, because you had to impress her one way or another so that she would say yes.
Which is kind of a failure, like you said, on the right, because the argument, anybody who argues that a monogamous society is the patriarchy is ignorant to all things biological. The patriarchy would be your polygamous societies. And the problem is you would end up with a Pareto distribution of the resource that is women, and your top 20% would have 80% of the wives. and you would have about 80% of the or 60% of the population that's angry men, which back in the old European days and in the societies around that, those men just ended up being soldiers and died in war, right? So monogamy itself is the female's choice, because left to the male biologically, you would just spread your seed around and have no economic resource depletion from the process.
Yeah.
You just keep going and make more. If you wanted to have a part in their raising to make sure that they went on to have children too, you would probably do a little bit there, but all the burden would be on the females that were selected.
Yeah.
So that would be the true patriarchy. We would go back to we just want to spread our seed.
And what you just said there is how marriage ties back to industriousness. Is it's focusing that male instinct for aggression into a more productive means, because you're focusing that industriousness on the male instinct to protect and provide for wife and for children. And so that's where marriage leads to better economic outcomes, because it's focusing that male attention. But it also leads to better civic outcomes. As John Adams puts it, the foundation of national morality must be laid in private families. How is it possible that children can have any just sense of the sacred obligations of morality or religion if, from their earliest infancy, they learn their mothers live in habitual infidelity to their fathers, and their fathers in as constant infidelity to their mothers? So this is tying back into the honesty part of it, of that foundation of morality for a child, and in the same way that you learn language without knowing you're learning it. You learn morality without knowing you're learning it, simply from observing and hearing. Marriage. Any further thoughts on marriage?
Not at the moment, no. Because we've had our discussions on other things around that.
Yeah, that's why I thought we might end up going a bit in this.
Yeah. I think my big thing that I kind of pulled from that was, it actually gave me a chance to give my little rant on the patriarchy. The traditional U.S. marriage is really more towards the maternal side, because she protects her investment, her higher biological investment. Now, as far as any of the other discussions, I don't think they're actually relevant, even though you thought it might get a little bit here, because there is a difference between just sowing your seed everywhere and actually having a stable marriage that has a polyamorous bend to it, I guess I should say. So the argument's completely different. No, I 100% agree that a mother-father dynamic is what's best for the child. And when we look economically, the shared income is obviously going to help you get ahead as well. So I don't think there's any disagreement on this specific topic.
There's an interesting quote from Alexis de Tocqueville here near the end, which goes to your idea of the patriarchy versus matriarchy. This is in his Democracy in America. If I were asked, now that I'm drawing to the close of this work, in which I have spoken of so many important things done by the Americans, to what the singular prosperity and growing strength of that people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, to the superiority of their women. And that was, that was attributed to this idea that arranged marriages had been rejected, and women held the power of of final say, of yes or no when it came to accepting that marriage. And it put them in a position of strength to run households and to raise children in a strong way.
Which actually, when you use the word egalitarian, everybody's heard the word, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. It's slightly bent in the other direction. The only reason anybody gets the illusion that it's not is because it creates an economic deficiency when the mother chooses to have children and take the time off to do so. So I think people lose the nuance in what is actually egalitarian just by focusing on one thing, which is economic success.
So. All right, and the final of his 4 founding virtues, religiosity. This is one of those things that's kind of been bastardized more recently, with people trying to paint a lot of the founders as not religious men and calling them deists. So far,
I'm actually curious where Murray's going to go with this, because he is not a religious man personally as well. But this also was written 10 years earlier than the current stuff that I was following.
Right. So he points out that Jefferson was openly a deist, and so far as I know, he was the only one who was openly a deist. A lot of the others, like Franklin, is often called a deist. He wasn't. He just rejected organized religion. He was a very spiritual, very Christian person who invoked Christian themes and religious language a lot in his writings, but he didn't attend a church regularly. And that was not just a lot of the founders, but a lot of Americans, in part from necessity. So a lot of these people had fled religious persecution and sometimes did singly or in small groups. So yeah, you would get, the small town built around the church, but a lot of these, especially frontier people, church was the house. There was no organized religious organization to attend in the first place, either because you were a frontier person or because you were a very small religious minority and there was nowhere to attend. So religion was ubiquitous in early American life, not just in attendance, but in practice and in thought.
Well, and you look at even just the setup. You said frontier life, but just farm life in general. For most people, it would have been a day travel to get to the nearest place of worship or whatever was organized and centralized. So it wasn't something that, you see on like Little House of the Prairie. They just go there the morning of and nobody shows that travel time in between. But if you've got, 5 50-acre farms between you and town, that's a significant day of travel just to get there.
He cites a lot of the founders' statements. A whole lot of the founders said something to the effect of speaking about the Constitution and the formation of the American government, that it was made for and will only work with a moral people. And I think we can look to modern history of what happens to a government system when it starts to be populated and run by people who are not particularly moral, and instead are selfish and greedy and corrupt.
Well, it kind of defeats the purpose of the representative government if you get to that power and you decide not to represent the people who put you there.
As Washington put it in his farewell address, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. So basically what he's saying there is uh, Murray is speculating that that middle sentence, whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, is he's probably talking about Jefferson there, because Jefferson was openly a deist. He was a highly educated. He was considered, he and Franklin were considered the smartest men of the age. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, basically what he's saying there is that that's fine for the individual, but you can't expect that of a whole population.
Which is what becomes interesting with, like, let's say, the great debates between Peterson and Sam Harris. Can morality be rationalized, or does it have to have a theological component to it? And I don't know. I think somewhere in between, they both. It was a great debate. It's a long debate to watch. It's four 2-hour parts, but I personally on my end, from what I got from reading their works and along those lines, is yes, it can. But what religion gives us is thousands of years of people putting down to paper a simplified version of that rationalization tested over time.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. And that's, I think Peterson might be going that direction with his thoughts, although he kind of seems to bounce back and forth on whether he's going to be religious or not. But I think his use of the archetype, but realistically, it's refining of knowledge over time, because we can look across world religions and get that same refining over time that end up with this moral structure that seems to work well for pro-social behavior. I mean, the 10 Commandments, if you really look at them, other than the first one, which is specific to Christianity, they all just make sense for having a pro-social society, how we should treat each other to get along in groups of more than 100 and not fall apart. But
yep.
And I personally think, just from his own writing, Jefferson understood that. He didn't know how to put it on paper. He didn't know how to express that. But I think the deists of our history understand that. They just don't know how to express it to someone who is religious.
Well, I think he did. I think where a lot of that conflict comes from is his own internal conflict, trying to work through his own mind of who or what God is, and how to balance the scientific with the theological, because in the Declaration there is an appeal to nature and nature's God, which is the big thing that religiosity brings, is that the whole point of the Declaration is that there is a power higher than any earthly king, and it is from that power, whether you call it God or nature or whatever, that from which we derive our individual rights, our rights with a capital R, simply for being human.
Which is kind of a good philosophical talk on the inalienable rights, right? Mm-hmm. What are the life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? Those are things that apply to the way I would describe it. This is what my take on it is, and it leads into how you brought that up. Is those are rights that I have whether I live here in this house or I'm on a deserted island somewhere. I have the right to life. I need to do what I need to do to have that life. I need to make shelter, find water, find a food source, where the industriousness comes through. So I need that trait to be successful for that life. I have the right to liberty. So if someone else comes on that island and wants to take control of me and make me their slave, I have the right to fight back and say no. And the pursuit of happiness. I have the right to try to do things that make me happy, but only as it pertains to the expense at the life and the liberty. So these are things I have the right to, but it doesn't mean they're guaranteed. But I'm allowed to fight for that right. So I'm allowed to be industrious and make my shelter and find my water and get my food. I'm allowed to resist the person who wants to take control of me. I am allowed to find things that make me happy with the understanding that it might cause those other two to suffer. So that's my take on it. Those are my rights, whether I'm alone on an island or I'm in my house. They're universal. Doesn't mean they're guarantees. They're just rights for your pursuit.
Yeah. Another way to look at it that I've heard is to look at what we talked early on. I talked about Locke and his idea of a state of nature, and so I've heard this analogized with an animal. So you have an inherent right to defend yourself. Look at a mother bear is going to defend herself and her cubs. That's just the way of nature. And if you're some idiot videographer and you go messing with her cubs and that mother bear kills you, people aren't going to blame the bear. They're going to blame you because that's her natural state. Right. So let's take a short break so I can refill my coffee, and then we'll get into the numbers here a little bit.
All right, we're back, and I wanted to touch on something before we went on, because in my analogy, or in my little island example of inalienable rights, the factor that should be apparent, but we'll have to say it out loud, I guess, is nature is always in the way of that. Nature is what it is. It's neutral. But there's so many things in it that could get in the way of those pursuits, i.e., you don't eat, you die. You don't find water, you die. You don't make shelter, you die. So life is more the pursuit of life and having to do the things you have to do to get it. It's not just something given to you.
Exactly, and that's where the distortion and bastardization of rights drives me crazy in our modern discussions of how do you have a right to healthcare? That's something someone else has to provide for you. You don't have a right. It's so the original phrasing of the Declaration of Independence was life, liberty, and property, because that was the saying of the time that came from Locke, but Franklin and Adams were concerned that would make the South think that they have a right to slavery, because they consider that their property, and that was one of the reasons it was changed. But I like the change,
but also the fact that that's a purely agricultural concept, versus if you're a nomadic society, that's going to be different. So it's not an inalienable right. It may be an American right. It may be an agricultural society right, but it's not an inalienable right that you have no matter what your situation is.
It is if you think about property in the proper context, but that's why I like the change to the pursuit of happiness. Okay. You don't have a right to a house. You have a right to your house that you put your time and energy and life into procuring. You have
because
the right
the stability of having that makes you less stressed and therefore more happy.
You have the right to pursue that, so long as you're not trampling on anyone else's inalienable rights. And once you have secured that, that is yours, and you have a right to it because you have put part of your life into that. I think I've used this analogy before that time isn't money, but money is time. Money is simply a physical representation of your time, of the percentage of your life that it took to get that dollar bill.
Well, not only that, money is kind of a social contract, because I can't barter my skill for a fish here and a cow on over here, and someone who can fix my shingles over there. That would just be impractical in the way modern society is. Especially, we can't just barter our skill or our trade for everything we need. So we need an intermediary, and that intermediary has to be understood to have some sort of value with respect to all those different trades. And so it's the trust, again, the honesty, it's the trust that holds value when I use my skill, and I'll be able to use that value to obtain something from somebody else's skill that meets my need, whether it's the butcher or the distiller or the person who fixes your house or builds the house in the first place. So money is a contract. It's a bond that acts as a middleman for the impracticality of the fact that we all have separate skills in what we do. In a smaller society, you can do something along that line, but in the scope of the United States of America, even in the scope of a town, the size of any town you would find in this area, it's not practical. But yeah, the other is the representation of your time or effort. You should use the word effort, because some things take less time, but they're worth a lot of money. So. But on the fact of the nature thing, and this is where I wanted to take it another step forward, when we're looking at authoritarian takeover on either the right or left or any spectrum you want to put it on, the easiest path to power is to ride the ultimate power of nature, whether that's using people's natural tribalism against each other, or something like a tide of a pandemic that you can jump on to get your way, by convincing people it is the best way to deal with this thing called nature that's always trying to kill us. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with that, just throw a nugget in people's minds on who benefits from what and why we need to be discriminatory on what we listen to, and make sure that there's some substance behind it, not just a riding of this tidal wave that is a certain thing in nature.
And it's not exactly a new concept. This is just a different
it's just the most recent example.
It's just a different way of saying, hey, I can appease the sun god so that your crops aren't burned to a cinder. So give me and my priestly caste the power over your life, and I will make sure that the sun god gives you just enough sun to make your crops grow, and not so much that it burns them. Okay. So I don't want to get too numbery because numbers can be hard to follow, and thanks to my finger, I didn't do as much prep as I wanted to.
But it's Murray. It's all about the numbers.
I know. I want to talk more generally about the splits in the numbers. So his mechanism for illustrating what he's talking about is he takes two case studies, Belmont and Fishtown, which are as he puts it, quasi-real. So there is a real Belmont. It's an upper middle class suburb of Boston, and there is a real Fishtown, which is a working class town just outside of Philly. So basically, what he does is to fit into his definitions of the new upper and the new lower class, is he takes these towns as his case studies, and then he basically lops off the tails of the bell curve. So he's just looking at the big middle section there to give the best representation of what he's talking about, and then how these founding virtues impact those two neighborhoods, those two towns. So he goes through, he actually starts with marriage, and I'm guessing because it's the easiest one to quantify. Not just in rates and divorces and all that, but he actually goes through some graphs of polling from the early 60s and now, of things like when should a woman get married? Is she happier if she is married? Those kinds of things. He also uses a lot. I don't know if he used this in yours, but the General Social Survey. the GSS.
Not ringing a bell.
Okay, well, it's a major tool by sociologists because it's a big time uh, um, survey on all manner of subjects out of a research center at the University of Chicago, and they've been doing it since 1972. So it's useful for showing showing changes over time. Um, so for things like the woman's role in marriage, that is obviously seen kind of a hockey stick drop since the 60s of people who think women should tend the family has obviously uh, dropped quite a bit. Um, but even though uh, even though they have that opinion, uh, the white upper class doesn't practice what they preach. And I've mentioned this before, that um, if you look at marriage in his case study of Belmont, the upper middle class, there's a little bit of a dip from 1960, but then it levels off pretty quickly, and it doesn't go down very much. Whereas in Fishtown, it plummets. Okay, so the percent married in Fishtown from 1960 to 2010, it goes from about 85% to about 50%. Whereas in the upper class neighborhood, it goes from about 95% to 88%. So yeah, there's a drop, but there's not a significant drop.
Well, I think that's at least partly a testament to the fact that most marriages are broken up over money. And when your argument is about expendable income versus required income, I think the heat of that argument takes on a little bit different temperature.
Right, but I think that's more attitudinal than anything, because money has always been an issue, and yet you did not see the divorce rates in the past when more people were more poor than you do now.
Well, I mean, the other side of that is the ease of
Exactly.
divorce, but
Yeah.
I mean, as far as what actually split the couple, was it their propensity to not be to not hold to a marriage, or is it the actual heat of the discussion when it's first world problems versus we're not making ends meet problems?
Well, I think it's both attitude and ease, because if you go in with the attitude of, you're not even thinking that this marriage is ever going to come apart, and if it's more difficult to dissolve the marriage, then you're incentivized to figure it out,
Mm-hmm.
which is what you have to think used to happen. I mean, he points out that in the 60s is when no fault divorces started to come into being, and so it's not an accident that you see those drops.
Well, yeah, I think when sometimes you have uh, just like sometimes resistance training can expose an underlying health problem. The fact that the ease of divorce increased might expose an underlying problem that was already existent within the lower class married couple. Okay, so now I'm a female and my husband. So going back to that first point earlier in the book, that men aren't able to make a living. I have that man that is unable to make a living. Maybe that's the core to the class difference, not the marriage itself. So that person, because they're lower class, married that person who is not industrious. And so therefore, now I'm making the decision of, do I stay with this person for the sake of the marriage, or they're actually a burden on my life and my children's life, and I can go try to marry somebody else that might be more industrious. So it creates a different dynamic than obviously the people that are in the upper class area. Either they already had money or they were more industrious to begin with. So we got a selection bias. in his data collection.
I wouldn't call it a selection bias. I think it's just demonstrating a multi-tiered problem.
Yeah, but I think if you followed that multi-tier, you can get back to the lack of the men there as the underlying issue. Not necessarily the fact that it's just the ease of divorce, because the ease of divorce is the same for everybody.
Mm-hmm. No, my point, and I think his with the ease of divorce, is that it means that when those problems do come up, there's only, so we've all worked really crappy jobs. How much you're making is part of whether you stick with that crappy job, but then the other part is how easy is it going to be for me to find another job.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're in college in a college town, I'm not going to stick with this crappy job because everybody's always hiring, because there's so much turnover at these lower levels of work, because college kids are constantly coming and going, right? Or decide that, that their workload and class load don't fit. So, why should I work for this annoying manager at McDonald's doing this really crappy job when I can just quit, and in a week I'll have another job.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that does add another variable, the ease of finding a mate. In the current age, you have at your fingertips thousands of people that you can match with, versus 100 years ago you might come across 50 women in your entire life. So there is that. But again, that is the same on the upper class neighborhood versus the lower class. So we got to all these things that we're bringing forward are the same. The divorce availability, the availability of a mate, across the board. And when we're looking for root causes, we got to go back down to the what's different between the two and what are the underlying traits. I would put another one in there when you talk about the female decision to stay home with children versus working a job while having children is higher staying home in the elite versus the lower class, because you need that second income just to get by. And when you have that dynamic, now you've got what would be a patriarchal type situation where the man's making all the money, the woman stayed home for 5 years raising a baby, and your availability to the workforce is less just because you have 5 years of not working, which is not desirable on any resume, no matter what reason. And so now you've got kind of a trap situation for that female. And like you said, it's female choice. That's not just with marriage. Most of the time, that's with divorce as well, because of the risk to the male's economic status if he was the one to make the first move versus the other way around. So I would say that would also play into it. And if we're looking for underlying causes, we got to look at the differences between the two, not all these things that are the same.
Well, I think that his next section actually addresses that to a degree, because if you're talking attitudes, another thing he looks at, because again, this is a multi-tiered problem, is the never married. So it's one thing to be single, and people can be unmarried for, because they got divorced, especially in the ages of 30 to 49, or because they never got married in the first place. And there is a sharp rise in the lower class neighborhood from below 10% to above 25% in never married. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it again is back to the attitude and that virtue of industriousness that these males are not being focused. And so not only does it affect them, but mm-hmm. then it impacts the family that they could have had. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of a bump in the upper class neighborhood, but again, it's going from like just below 5% to around 10%. So yeah, you're seeing these trends throughout America, but these trends that are reflective of these founding virtues that he's looking at are much more significant, are much more pronounced when you look at the data lines in this lower class neighborhood case study that he's looking at.
I think we might be chicken or egging some of this too.
Well, we do,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm trying to that. And I'm glad that he points out he's got all these different graphs under different categories, because it's not a chicken or an egg, because it's a multi-tiered problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all of these elements that point to problems with establishing and sustaining a family life.
Does he separate in any way? So to throw out the concept of, there are people that are poor because of life situation, and there are people that are poor because of their habits. Like if you have a 85 IQ and you started in a poor family, chances are you're probably going to be poor the rest of your life. That's life situation. Whereas if you just are not industrious, then you can go from rich to poor if you're really bad about it. So and there are some people that you can just look at their life and say, there's a reason you're poor, because you just can't get out of this habit base that you have.
Well, and that's what he's looking at with all of these graphs and surveys, and if you go to the end of the book where he gives the size of the new lower class and what he's looking at, and I mean that his first category is men who can't make a basic living, or who aren't making a basic living. And as he gives the numbers there, again, that's pretty much your choice. If you look at how easy it is to get over the poverty line in America. I mean, you gave the numbers. Only 1.5% of hourly jobs are minimum wage. And if you work a 40-hour week at minimum wage, for a single person, you're going to be living a sustainable life. But you're not even going to be earning minimum wage. And there have been even now, with as low as, so you look at the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, depending on whose numbers you're looking at, and it's pretty significant, especially after all of the economic disruptions and disasters from the lockdowns. And yet there have been you also look at the number of job openings. Well, how is this possible? Well, you look at any number of stories talking about this, and if you dig into the story enough, you find that the number one reason people say they can't find a job is because they can't find a job in their preferred profession. That's a you problem, buddy.
Yeah.
Back to the dirty jobs example is,
I was going to go back to Kaepernick, but
well, yeah,
because remember he was having trouble getting recruited in football, and he was highly recruited in baseball.
No, you know what? That's a great analogy, because Cam Newton just signed a 1-year deal to go back to the Panthers. Okay, well, but Cam Newton is willing to be a backup at this point in his career. Now he's starting because the starter is out, so he started this Sunday. But when the starter's healthy, he's probably going to. I'm brain farting on the guy's name. He's probably going to be.
It's Darnold.
It's Darnold. Yeah, that was another example of are there really such things as draft busts, or is it just because the Jets suck?
Yeah.
But Kaepernick could have been signed if he was willing to be a backup and take a backup salary. He was not.
Or even get in a situation where he could compete for the starting position versus just being named the starter. That's the completely different beast too. But no, you're absolutely right. Are you getting a job because you need a job, or are you trying to find the job you want? And now when we look at the college situation, the university situation, the fact that everybody goes to university anymore almost is saturated the field so much that's why you have this whole useless degree thing. There used to be a day and age when if you got a degree, you were the cream of the crop. And so that actually watered down other social programs such as affirmative action. So affirmative action, had the university system stayed the way it was, would have put a group of people that were put in that situation into a very advantageous situation because they had a degree and most of the rest of the country did not. Now everybody and their dogs got a degree in whatever because
and now more and more everybody and their dog is having an advanced degree.
Yeah, because as you get to the second year of your, and it's, you know, engineering is too tough, you just drop to the next level, and or psychology is too tough, so you become a social worker. It just kind of waters down as time goes on because they're trying to keep you in school to take your money. I had an exit interview for my master's degree, which is physiology and biomechanics, and they said, well, what was your biggest downside to our program? What would you change if you could? I said, it was too damn easy. And they kind of turned off the mic and we're like, well, as to that, we can't make it any harder because then we would have a higher dropout rate and the university doesn't want that. And then back to recorded interview. And I'm like, yeah, all right. Thank you for making my degree useless. All right.
Here's your problem right there. Yeah. Well, because there was this push for college degrees was selection bias married with greed, because the people in the big university industry, they wanted more dollar bills, y'all. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there was a push to make public policy push more money into higher education and push more people into higher education. And they were using numbers to say, see, look how much more these people make. Mm-hmm. Well, again, selection bias, because you're only going, in 1970, you're only going to college to get a difficult technical degree to go into a difficult technical field. Okay. Yeah, there were those people who studied the humanities or whatnot to get a teaching position or something like that, but that was a very small number to fill a small field. Most of the people going to universities were going because they were going into a field that required that higher degree of difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now we create the student loan crisis. Mm-hmm. Because student loans and student aid in general has made it easy for almost any American to go to school, no matter how poor you started. I have to say I'm a beneficiary. So for it was the way out, but because it made it so easy, it also created a crisis on the other end. If you were the high functioning poor person, you got through it and you became a doctor or you became an engineer or something along those lines, you were able to pay off those student loans.
Right. Because there's a cost benefit analysis there.
Whereas you weren't that high functioning individual coming from that same exact background. Now, not only did you go to school and collect those student loans, you developed a skill that's not useful in the economic workforce. So now you're almost worse off than if you never went to college.
Yeah.
So that ease that made it possible for the high functioning low income person to get out of that situation also created a worse situation for the average functioning to low functioning person from a poor background. And it actually, it wasn't selective enough. Like there should have been some sort of performance criteria to go along with it if you really look back in hindsight.
Yeah, but that's back to the turn the mic off and, well, we can't make it harder because we don't want dropouts because those aren't paying customers.
Yeah, when we're talking about the student loan forgiveness and everything, I would actually almost be on board if the universities themselves had to pay it back, not the federal taxpayer or the state taxpayer. If the person responsible from this, for perpetuating the situation did it. It's like, oh yeah, we shouldn't have just offered all these programs to make it easy to get through school.
Right. Well, that's the way things work now, the too big to fail bailouts. Okay. If you look at the 1980 savings and loan crisis, okay, yes, there was a government bailout there. There was a government bailout for the consumers who got ripped off and it was the government money was making up the difference. It wasn't the government coming in and bailing everybody out. It wasn't bailing out the savings and loans. Savings and loans went bankrupt and had all of their assets seized and sold off to pay their debtors, or to pay their creditors. Okay, so the government came in to make up the difference. It wasn't to save the savings and loans. It was to save the people who got ripped off. Okay, so same thing. I like your idea. Same thing here of, okay, how many, vice presidents of diversity and inclusion do you have making six figures? Those need to go away, and you need to, help bail out some of these people that you screwed.
Well, administration in general. There was a day and age when professors outnumbered the administrators, and it's flipped. I think it's even exponentially so, that there's more people responsible for the running of the institution than there are people teaching at the institutions.
And that's secondary school too. If you look at if you look at elementary, high school, and all that, people who say we need more money to go to education, it's the number one expenditure for pretty much every state and municipality. But look at where the money's going, and you see an absolute ballooning of the administrative bureaucracy for these school districts. So where's the money going?
Well, and you can even look at private sector examples of this, where the pursuit of money overpowers the pursuit of correct. In our industry, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, American Academy of Sports Medicine, all of these National Academy of Sports Medicine, all of these big organizations that have their certifications for personal training and strength and conditioning and all the little lesser certifications they have, they are the biggest lobby against making our profession a health licensed profession, which is what it should be. Someone has to go to school and get a federal license to call something a therapeutic massage. But I can put 450 pounds at your feet and you're 90 years old and say, it's a good idea, pick that up, and have no liability, because it's not a licensed profession. And anybody can do it. It's a certified profession. But they sell so many certifications that they would lose billions of dollars if it became a licensed profession.
Yeah.
Who cares that we would be able to bill insurance, make more money, actually separate ourselves from the jackhole that just says, I know how to work out and got an overnight certificate. Never mind that on our end. Never mind that it would be good for the American people, but they make billions of dollars on this. So even the better of the companies like ACSM and NSCA, when it comes to quality, are still fighting the fact that it should be a more regulated industry because people's lives are in your hands. But that's a private industry example. It's a watered down industry because they would lose money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How many emails a week do you get for continuing education classes or different certifications or whatever? I get a lot.
Quite a few.
All right. All right. So I want to flip to the section on industriousness, because that's basically what we were talking about, and you brought up the the attitudinal versus the circumstantial, and I think this really illustrates what he's going at here with the it's a you problem, which is what I see as kind of the driving idea behind a lot of this. So the GSS that I mentioned earlier, beginning in 1973, part of the survey was look at these choices and then rank them of which thing on the list you would most prefer in a job. Okay. And it was high income, no danger of being fired, chances for advancement, working hours are short, lots of free time, and finally work important and gives a feeling of accomplishment. So it was these five categories, and rank them. So it was in almost every survey from 73 through 94, and then they stopped giving it because the answers were so consistent. So an average of 58% of the votes were always, the top choice was always gives a feeling of accomplishment. And the least chosen was always short work hours and no danger of being fired. Those were always around 5%. Well, they brought it back in 2006, and that had changed pretty significantly. So first place votes for short working hours and no danger of being fired had doubled or more than doubled, from 9 to 13%. And the feeling of accomplishment had dropped from 58% to 43%. So there was a serious attitude change in industriousness of, I mean, those last two choices of no danger of being fired and short working hours, that's just let me coast through, man.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a I'm curious how you would, but just instinctually, I feel like this is a backlash from the self-esteem movement, because why do you need to work to get a feeling of accomplishment if you're constantly told that you're awesome?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they play hand in hand, because I think the short work hours and the no danger of being fired give you the luxury of having that first one drop. Because realistically, if you want to break it down, if you're doing something that has a sense of accomplishment, it probably, I would guarantee, almost most of the time, would be something that was useful to society, right? So you don't feel accomplished doing something that doesn't benefit you or other people in a great way. So I think that sense of accomplishment kind of is skewed data, because you're going to get that higher pay, and you're going to get that greater job security. You're going to get that higher sense of security. What was the other one? Pay, security.
Well, the three that, so the five categories were high income, no danger of being fired, chances for advancement,
Okay.
Short hours, and feeling of accomplishment.
Okay, so I think accomplishment always wins out, because if you do something that gives you that feeling, we inherently know what's useful to ourselves in society. So that means you're doing something useful. So you automatically increase the other four if you're doing something that benefits other people. Because if you do something that has value, you're going to get paid more. If you do something that has value, you're not going to lose your job. You do something that has value. What was the third one again?
Chances for advancement.
Yeah, you do something that has value, you're going to move up the ladder, right? The only one that doesn't really fit there is the shorter work hours. That doesn't fit directly with the feeling of accomplishment, unless you get good at your job and you can work less, right? So that sense of accomplishment, the reason why it's statistically higher is because if you do that, you automatically have the other ones. And I think unconsciously or subconsciously, we know that. And so that tends to be the most desirable position to have, because you inherently know you're going to get all the other ones based on it. You're not going to go into a job saying, I am useful to society, I'm going to become a doctor, it pays $5 an hour. It just doesn't work that way. Society has never worked that way. And because we grow up, and this is some culturalization, right? We grow up on that. We inherently know that if you produce for society, now the shift is related to what you said, because now, because of that watering down we just talked about, because of the you do you culture we've kind of gotten into, and the we're going to congratulate you no matter what you do versus only when you do something useful, that sense of accomplishment wanes because it's no longer as highly correlated with the other results. And when you do, I mean, it obviously it's no brainer that it's going to water down.
It also illustrates further how this is a multi-tiered problem and how these things all tie together, because a man is going to get more feelings of accomplishment if he's doing something for more than just himself. Okay, we crave that outside recognition. Well, that primarily historically has come from your family, right? When you have that feeling of accomplishment of working hard and reaping those rewards, then you get the attention from your mate, you get the respect from your offspring. Well,
I'd say it goes even deeper than that, because the community respect, I mean, if you go even pre-marriage, you have a higher selection of mate. If you are this high accomplishing male. So it's kind of like a similar to the alpha male perspective of it. You have more selection of the mates you want. And in a monogamous society, you have more selection of the mate you want.
So what happens if you don't care about marriage? Whether you don't care to get married in the first place, or you don't really care if your marriage stays together, whether consciously or subconsciously.
Well, it depends on how much you want to keep mating.
Well, but then that feeling of accomplishment is less relevant. All you need is enough money to get by, enough money to, go on enough dates to get laid.
As a person who works with athletes at all levels, there's not untruth to what you said. Now there's a difference in income, because if you are able to break through to that professional level, you're obviously making more than your average Joe. But then when you move on from that, if you haven't gotten that long-term something to work for, then I do see a lot of that. They just have no idea how to intrinsically motivate themselves to keep going and to keep becoming successful. They basically try to coast on their previous successes a lot of the time. So yeah, you do have something to that. Now, societal attention can probably help with that to some degree, but they have to find that something to keep going for more than themselves, because it all inevitably burns out.
Well, I don't remember what show this was, but I remember several years ago, Mark Schlereth was talking about this because of the obsessive focus on CTE. And his point was, look, I'm not saying this isn't a problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at this, but this being the only problem is blinding us to other things. I think this was shortly after Junior Seau had committed suicide. And his point was, so you're ignoring the fact that from a pretty early age, these people have devoted their entire life to this. Their entire life is football. So what happens when they can't do that anymore? So he said, for me, as an example, I got into acting. I got into, broadcasting and commentating. I had something else to make part of my life so that I didn't have that gaping hole when it was done.
Well, look at our previous military suicide rates. The number one factor noted in that is the all of a sudden lack of purpose when they're no longer a soldier. And that's usually cited as the number one cause is the lack of purpose, which for sorry, we're not gender neutral on this channel, but for us males, that is higher than with the females. Where was I going to go with? Oh, so back to the football analogy. You can always tell when a player is going to be one of the greats versus just really good right now. because you look at their contract negotiations and how they play. You can tell the ones that play because they want to be the best ever versus the ones that are just playing for the money and a little bit of instant fame. So, to some people, being the best ever is the fame. To some people, my fame right now is the fame. And you can see that. That's why you have Hall of Famers versus others. You can look at their play. You can look at their contract negotiations. You can look at their off-season activities. You can look at the way they handle the rest of their life. And you can see the difference. It's pretty obvious. It's not even hard to see. Someone like Le'Veon Bell had the chance to be one of the best running backs ever. But you know what? 20 years from now, no one's going to remember his name.
Yeah.
Maybe the Pittsburgh fan that remembers that year, other than that, no one's going to know. He's already washed up. He's playing at a mediocre level for mediocre teams. And some people will be surprised he's still playing. But someone like Adrian Peterson is a modern example. He just kept trying and kept trying and kept trying and kept trying. And even through some injuries and some setbacks, he's probably still going to be remembered down the road. Or someone like Emmitt Smith or Barry Sanders, or just to stick with running backs. They just kept going until their name was etched into the forever line. Did old man fall asleep over there?
Well, I was trying to decide. I'm self-editing as I go here. If I think that pretty well hammers that in.
That was Industriousness.
Yep, that was Industriousness. Honesty. He uses crime rates, and shows the rising trend from 60 to 2010 of people in this white neighborhood, this white lower class neighborhood of prisoners per 100,000 of the population, arrests and whatnot. And it's, in that upper class neighborhood, it's basically a flat line, and it jumps way up for the lower class neighborhood from 60 to, you talked a lot previously about the general decline in crime rates that started to happen in the 90s. And so you do see that in that white lower class neighborhood, but it's still significantly higher than it was in 1960 and way higher than it is in the upper class neighborhood.
Well, which drives a point home, because this is a worldwide trend in a drop in violence. Go to Steven Pinker's work or anything along those lines. Worldwide trend in drop in violence, but also we have a worldwide increase in affluence. And now you're talking about a class gap between these two, and one has a certain trend line versus another. Affluence does play a difference in violence. Again, chicken or egging here. Is the higher violence causing the lower rates, or the lower incomes, or is the lower incomes causing the higher violence? But at the same time, we do see the exact same trend lines. So the higher the affluence, the lower the violence rates.
And hand in hand with that, I think, is the final section on religiosity, which is for the non or anti-religious. There's a stereotype that the Bible thumpers are your lower class ignorant white folk, but that's actually not true. And anyone who attends church regularly knows that the bigger, more populous churches are the ones in the middle and upper middle class neighborhoods.
Well, I was told in business 10 years ago, somewhere around there, they said, if you want to be successful in business, learn to play golf and go to a mega church, because that's how you're going to get most of your business.
Yeah, that's where you're going to network. But so you see, and the importance of this is, so I've said before, and it's important to reiterate that when Nietzsche said God is dead, that was not a celebratory statement. He was saying God is dead and we haven't replaced him with anything else. And that's a bad thing. So The increasing secularization of America is a problem, not just because I'm a believer, but because I I know where that substitute moral education is coming from, and it's nothing good. It's it's postmodernism, progressivism nonsense that has completely taken over pop culture and the schools. So if you're not getting that moral education from Sunday school and from a religious family like you used to, okay, well then your moral education is coming from what media you consume and what you get at when you go to school, which is where you spend most of your time.
Which is where the I was going to say Harris, but I'm just going to say the horsemen of the modern atheists are kind of correct in the fact that their argument is a little off, but they're correct in their intention. Is that their argument is you can rationalize morality, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what their argument needs to be is, here is a rational basis for morality for those that don't believe in a theological system, because now we can create this moral code, so to speak, when you still have that trouble making the leap of faith. And they need to be a voice to the, but the problem is they do reach some of the quote unquote academic elites, and part of that's their language, part of that's their background, part of that's their their own snobbery, right? Versus reaching the masses of lower income, lower education individuals that have trouble with that whole faith thing. And those people are easily swayed. You would think they'd be hard to sway because they can't be swayed into religion, but no, they have that black hole that is needing to be filled. So they need to find a way to reach that mass of people with their same ideology of universal humanity. So that would be my 2 cents in there, where they're right in their intention, but they're wrong in their delivery.
Right. And again, going back to Washington's farewell address, is that education works fine on an individual level, but it's hard to extrapolate and translate that to a mass movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just the reality that most people don't want to think for themselves in a lot of things. They pick and choose 1 or 2 things that they choose to be free thinking of, and then everything else they let happen.
Or can't choose. I mean, one of the reasons these, rational atheists that you talk about, one of the reasons they're able to create these non-theological moral structures is because they have the time, not just the ability, the mental ability to think these things through, but they have the time to think these things through.
Well, let's look at it like having food on your plate, right? The plate can be time, could be mental ability, can be anything that would allow you to have a multifaceted life. And some people's plate is just smaller than others, and they have a big plate when it comes to time, mental ability, education, resources such as money. None of them are poor, right? And when you have less of those other resources, you got to allocate your attention in certain areas. And when it comes to, the theological approach or the morality approach, whether you're a theist or you're not, most people give up that to a secondary source.
Yeah.
And if you have so much on your plate that you can't spend time to rationalize morality, then you're going to be subject to the next person that comes in and puts an idea in your head, so to speak, about it.
Well, it's especially something like religion and morality and ethics. These are complicated subjects because they're very difficult to quantify, and because when you're talking about the human psyche and human action, you're talking about a lot of variables, a lot of things that you have to think through. Most people don't experiment in the kitchen. They follow a recipe. because when you think about all the different flavor combinations when it comes to seasonings, when you think about all of the different cooking techniques that you can use, you're talking about a lot of variables. That's why it's a lot easier to have someone else do the experimenting and thinking for you, and then you just find the recipe that you like.
And some people just don't have the mind for experimentation either. They are, we talked about followers and leaders. The majority of the world is follower. They don't have that expanding mind. Now, again, because of the selection bias that we talked about, more Americans, I think, have that expanding mind than say your average Syrian citizen. So, but at the same time, it's a lot. There's a lot to be thought about in that realm. And you know, someone that like yourself that grew up in a religious family, you have that moral blueprint, even though there might be excessive things included in that blueprint. Whereas we're letting our child kind of make his own way, because he gets some religious stuff in when he would go to the daycare we sent him to, or through his friends, or his mother. She's not atheist, but she's not really practicing religious, but so some things still come that direction. My mom and stuff. But when I deal with him and he does something wrong, but what I would consider wrong, I'd say, Ben, was that pro-social or antisocial behavior? And he would go, antisocial, Dad. I was like, okay, so there, you learn from it. You're not going to better your own life through being a social beast by that behavior, right? He's like, yeah, no. So he will develop his own conclusions in the end, but I don't know. Did I derail that?
Nope. But that's a good place to wrap that particular topic up, because I want to get to what I feel is the conclusion and solution, which, again, one of our disappointments with his latest book was the lack of conclusions and solutions.
And as I concluded last time, I think it was because it was lack of knowledge on all the other factors that could go into the results versus just the things he accounted for in his statistical analysis.
The tacit assumption of the advanced welfare state is correct when human beings face starvation or death by exposure. Then food and shelter are all that count. But in an advanced society, the needs for food and shelter can be met in a variety of ways, and at that point, human needs can no longer be disaggregated. The ways in which food and shelter are obtained affects whether other human needs are met. People need self-respect, but self-respect must be earned. It cannot be self-respect if it's not earned. And the only way to earn anything is to achieve it in the face of the possibility of failing. People need intimate relationships with others, but intimate relationships that are rich and fulfilling need content, and that content is supplied only when humans are engaged in interactions that have consequences. People need self-actualization, but self-actualization is not a straight road visible in advance running from point A to point B. Self-actualization intrinsically requires an exploration of possibilities for life beyond the obvious and convenient. All of these good things in life, self-respect, intimate relationship, and self-actualization, require freedom in the only way that freedom is meaningful. Freedom to act in all arenas of life, coupled with responsibility for the consequences of those actions. The underlying meaning of that coupling, freedom and responsibility, is crucial. Responsibility for the consequences of actions is not the price of freedom, but one of its rewards. Knowing that we have responsibility for the consequences of our actions is a major part of what makes life worth living. So that's kind of his conclusion, and it ties into his solutions, which, as he puts it, I'm paraphrasing here, is that when you look at all the data that I've just laid out, that depending on your point of view, you'll come to different conclusions. So if you're more of a political liberal leaning, you're going to see the need for social programs that address these failings to help shore up these things in people's life. If you're more of a political conservative, you're going to see the need for programs that promote these positive virtues, but I'm more libertarian, he says. So I have a different view, which is basically we need to get out of the way to let people experience life. That was kind of his point there of, yeah, people are going to fail and that's going to hurt, but that's how you learn.
Yeah. I think it's parsing words too, because I think he's still using liberal in the anybody who's not the right definition versus separating out the liberal now from the progressive.
No, when he's talking about the political liberal and the political conservative, that's more in the context of the policy prescriptions that you tend
well,
towards.
but I'm saying they're different too, because there's a difference between socialism and a social safety net.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge difference. So supplying for people who, okay, so the far left, and I'm not going to use the word liberal here, the far left would be more of a socialist society, would be, and everybody should have this basis on the way up. The far right, where their mistake is they refuse to account for this thing that does exist, which is luck in life. You can do everything right and still fail in the world just because of circumstance. Where a true liberal that's not extreme left would say we need to account for that luck in life, but still have that responsibility for your own actions, because that's what accounts for freedom of action. So a true liberal would have a libertarian bend, but with an understanding of the fact that there is this thing called luck, and it's hard to differentiate from behavior. So that I think that's where he kind of goes wrong there, because he's putting that liberal in that far left where everything's a safety net. But you have to account for behavior, and I think a lot of the true liberals of the world would agree with that. So it's somewhere towards the libertarian, but with a bigger safety net underneath to account for luck.
I think he's not wrong in that categorization, in that people of all political persuasions, whatever your personal political philosophy, we've all gone wrong by becoming more and more obsessed with government and government policy. So the practical effects of your political philosophy is to push for these types of policies, which, as you're pointing out, may actually run contrary to what your true philosophical views are. But our political philosophy debates have turned into political debates, political party debates.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we've, one of the many ways we've gone off the rails. I do think he makes an interesting point, though, that I'm inclined to agree with, which is that the basic premise of the welfare state is flawed because it's not really applicable to modern society, because it's too easy. I mean, as he kind of points out with his numbers on making a living and the minimum hourly wage that you would need to get over that poverty line for yourself, is it's not that hard to meet your basic needs in an advanced society. The idea, and it's something I thought about when I was reading this, is that there's a flaw in the give a man a fish, teach a man to fish principle, because sometimes you do have to give a man a fish.
Mm-hmm.
If he's starving, he doesn't have time to learn how to fish because he's starving. So there are mission groups in Africa that will try and do this, and they'll they'll give them, chickens or goats or whatever with the idea that, well, now you'll have eggs and milk, except they go back later and they've killed all the animals they gave them because they were starving. They didn't have time to wait on the eggs. They didn't have time to wait on the milk. They needed to eat now or they're going to die. So there is an element of both to that saying, and I do think he has a point in that it might not be applicable to modern society unless you're talking about the very fringes of society, which would be, as you pointed out, the circumstance, not the choice. So if you look at, especially in the Northeast, the overwhelming majority of homeless people are homeless because they're mentally ill. So that is one of those positions that is one of those points where, then that welfare society makes sense, because this is someone who can't or is going to have a lot of trouble learning how to fish.
Well, the original mathematicians that were developing game theory analogized life to be more like poker than like chess, because everybody wanted to say life was like chess. But in chess, skill always wins. Skill never, ever, ever, ever loses. But in poker, skill helps, but sometimes you still lose. And if skill wasn't a big factor, we wouldn't have a world championship of poker, because everybody would just play and whoever's luckiest that day would win. So obviously there are people who are better at it than others, but it's those that are better at it than others are able to differentiate between what was my decision versus what was luck. And that's why I can't ascribe full-on libertarian, because that makes it a chess game. If you have the most the most industrialization, the most honesty, the best marriage habits, what was the other one he had?
Religiosity,
the most
honesty.
If you checked all four of those boxes, you're successful. It's not the case. If you check all four of those boxes, you can still end up failing in the world. Whether it be, it could be for so many factors. It could be just you could have grown up in Morgantown and never left, right? After everything shut down. You could have gotten a disease that debilitated you and took away your earning income as you were on your way up. So any one of those number of bad luck factors could come along. So you could get hit by a car going through a green light when they ran a red light. So luck does play into it, and we need a social system to account for that. Now, where I think we go wrong is the right and the left, everything is results oriented. So we're looking at the end result. The right, lower taxes is the end result. Whereas there are things along the way you have to account for to make that happen. First of all, which we got to lower spending, by the way. But also it's not the end it's not the policy is a result policy. Whereas you go on the other side, socialism, bring everybody up to equality or equity, is an end result where the system has to go from the bottom up. Whereas this gives you an equal chance, but at the same time, it's not going to guarantee your outcome, and we got to be okay with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to a lot of what he's talking about here and what we've been talking about, where I think the right has gone wrong is in this idea of family policy. I've grown to hate that phrase, and a lot of the evangelical right, the political Christian right that started to arise in the 90s, especially. I mean, obviously it was there before, but it kind of became to prominence. It became a political power in the 90s. Is this so the group Focus on the Family? You know, that's a good Christian organization with a good mission statement, but then became flawed in its focus on the family in politics. You don't need government policy for biological imperatives. You don't need to create a government incentive to get people to breed. It's ingrained in our DNA. It is a driving force for us to establish mates and offspring, and then work to provide for and secure that unit. That is a biological imperative.
Which if you really think about it, the fact that we have trouble resisting that urge is actually a bigger problem than the other way around. Because then we're doing it before we can provide. Now, I would say the other end of that, provide for, is typically greater on the female side versus the male side, because the male side can just go make more and more and more and more and more. And subconsciously, we know that. Whereas the female side puts a pretty damn big investment into it.
Well, I think the male side provides for in a different way. And I think that's where that cultural reinforcement comes from, to be more than just the male chimp trying to bang everything that moves. Because we are more than the sum of our parts. And so if there is that cultural reinforcement of these values, then it will focus our drive in that way. If that makes sense.
That now we're getting on that spectrum.
Yeah.
For some, yes. For some, no. In fact, the monogamous situation, because of what we talked about with polygamous societies, is you get the distribution of female attention is to the top such and such percent of the males, is not only female choice in a monogamous situation, but also you're looking at a benefit to the beta males. So we're in a democratic society, a democratic republic. You need votes. So what's going to benefit more people actually has more power than what's going to benefit few in that situation. I wish we could do this with corporate America too, because we're kind of sliding in the other direction if people would just kind of realize it. But what benefits more people versus what benefits the top people?
Yeah. That is a problem. And I think so. One of my examples of my prime example, because I've studied it so much, of how you don't need government policy to get people to act on their biological imperatives, is Japan. Japan has a huge, they have negative demographics right now. Their population growth is, last I looked, it was in the negative. It was no longer zero, but it was negative. And they've finally really started to realize that and freak out about it. And they're trying to, make all of these public policies to incentivize people to get married and have children. Well, again, people don't need incentives for that. The problem in Japan is that they have created all these roadblocks to that. So, I met a number of people when I was studying abroad there that were in their 30s and had to move back home because it was so expensive to live in the urban areas that they had to move back and live with their parents. You can't start, you don't want to start a family if you're living in a 300 square foot apartment. Mm-hmm. And that's the best you can manage because of how insanely expensive the cost of living is in Japan. So you don't need the right needs to stop looking at, stop playing party politics and policy and say, what have we done that is interfering with people being able to live this life? And the left too, all sides are not talking about political philosophy, but they're talking about political policy. Before you say we need to have the government do this to make this happen, we should be asking, what roadblocks has the government put in place that is keeping people from living their life and achieving these positive ends?
Well, and on the other end, so let me crap on the left here. You've got an inoculation of imaginary roadblocks that are being thrown into it. And so you've got the right fighting the left on that, the left fighting the right on this. You're creating roadblocks because of this, but it's abstract and it's not there. And then you've got the right saying, no, that doesn't exist. And we need to do things now because you're fighting us on this nuclear family thing. We need to do things to make it more possible or make it more of a guarantee.
Yep.
That still wasn't much of a conclusion from him. Even, I mean, it was more than the other book, but
yeah,
again, he kind of almost like he fizzled out at the end, which shows his strengths. His strengths, the numbers, compiling the information.
Yeah, other people are the policy people.
Yeah. Which again, if you're going to be that way, I think realistically you need to do a collaboration book with someone who's more of an answers guy. But
and I don't know why he doesn't, because he's a member of several different conservative libertarian think tanks. So there are plenty of well-credentialed scholars and authors that he could collaborate with.
Listening to him interview, I would say it's probably because he didn't like any of their answers. And so he doesn't want to sign off his name onto the collab. That would be, but again, I would be making assumptions there. So, but that would be my assumption of why that's never happened, or nobody wants to attach their name to his.
Yeah,
there's that other side of it too.
Well, just on the numbers that he lays out and how much detail he goes into in this book, it is kind of mind-boggling of what his most recent book is, because so much of what he says at the very beginning that his whole point of focusing in just on white America is because one, so much has already been written about race, and two, the fixation on race derails us from what we should have been focusing on, because then everything becomes a racial issue. And his point of the book is that this isn't a racial issue. This is a virtue issue, that we are losing these founding virtues, and it is leading to these negative outcomes. It's leading to this growing lower class who are stuck in this negative economic and social position.
Which is, again, where he ends up putting himself in the bad situation. He says it's not a racial issue, but it's a virtue issue, but yet you have a racial disparity. So now you're implying that if someone wants to read it that way, this certain demographic has this virtue problem as well. And I think that's where he keeps putting himself in a corner.
And I could see what he was trying to do by making it not a racial issue, because he's focusing purely on white populations and saying, here are the problems in these neighborhoods. Because again, it would be much more explicit if he was looking across racial lines and saying, you have a problem with industriousness in these black neighborhoods, and oh my gosh, the racism.
Which is where he went in the next book.
Yeah.
He did put it along those, and in the bell curve as well. So he keeps putting himself in this corner, but without having that person that could say, yes, this is happening in this group more than others, but it's also happening in just the poor, in the socioeconomic level. Now, here's why it could be happening that has nothing to do with the fact that they're inherently this way. And he's missing that step. I tried to bridge that gap a little bit in the last one, but again, without him taking that step to say this this is why it's not a racially defined trait.
Yeah.
And then having examples of that, because he keeps saying that, but he doesn't have a substance behind his statement,
which is a real shame, because one of the great things about Murray is that he's very good at explaining numbers, which for a lot of people is difficult to wrap your head around. So
but you understand the numbers, but you don't understand the witchcraft. And remember, I had to go into the witchcraft to get to some of the things that could be underlying issues.
Right.
And so he's probably the same way.
Yeah.
He probably understands the numbers. It's an accountant versus a mathematician. An accountant doesn't do well with algebra and calculus and all of those things, but they can crunch those numbers all day long. He can crunch high level statistics all day long and separate these different things without knowing underlying causes that are biological or sociological.
And more importantly, I think in this realm, he can crunch those numbers and he can explain the numbers. He can explain why they're important. He can explain why he's using the numbers he's using and what they mean. But then, as you say, he's not particularly great at going beyond that, at taking that next step. And that's all I've got to say about that.
Well, yeah, in this realm, though, that's doubly important, because if you don't take that next step, you almost deserve to be put in the camp you were. So you've got to either be able to do it or find someone who can help you do it.
Or say, as you've talked about, with one of the ways you've got good research, if you're looking at a study or at a scientific article, is when they lay out, this is what we don't know. These are the questions that need to be asked. This is what someone else needs to do.
Which he did the exact opposite of it. He said, because I can't think of anything else, there has to be some disparity in ability.
Yeah. Rather than saying, let me show you what I see in the numbers. Here's what I see in the numbers. Here's what I think they mean. Here's what I think the ramifications are. But now I don't know X, Y, and Z, and that's what needs to be studied and expounded on further by others.
There are some missing links. But yeah, I think we've beaten this one to death. I think we might be done with Murray. We might reference him in other conversations, but it was a difficult assignment, I would say, to do without falling in that exact same corner. And unfortunately, there is the fact that no matter what you said, that some people would already lump you in that corner, no matter what you say. But I think anybody who wanted a nuanced conversation on it wouldn't.
Yeah. Well, so that's it for that. But speaking of witchcraft, what I want to talk about next time is Wheel of Time.
Oh yes,
because the first episode comes out in a few days, and I'm terrified.
Yeah, and are we going to talk about the social justice aspect of it?
Yeah, because I think one of my great concerns with it, and anyone who reads it will quickly learn that Robert Jordan has a very interesting and an amusing way of illustrating gender roles, not just gender roles, but gender attitudes, which I find hilariously insightful and pretty accurate. Yeah, he's being somewhat stereotypical, but there's a reason stereotypes exist. Okay.
Well, and from what I understand is the reason people liked the way he portrayed women from their point of view was his wife helped him write the book.
Yeah.
And so she helped, like, no, you're completely off base here, or no, that's actually kind of cool, Right. But I thought you were going to go into the racial aspect, because they really made that push for the diverse cast.
And that was one of the things. It wasn't the diversity for the sake of diversity per se that made me worry. It was, if you're so focused on this, how in the world are you going to be able to give the gender roles? Because the gender roles make up a huge part of the story and the world. And one of the criticisms I've seen of of Jordan and Wheel of Time is that it's very unflattering. Well, of course it's unflattering because these are flawed characters, because they're people. That's what makes it so
well,
good.
and it was their growth throughout the series.
Yes.
That was what made it special. They were country bumpkins in the beginning, with all of their inherent prejudices and to go along with it, and they grew throughout. And when it came to the ethnic roles, is one of the themes of the book was that you could tell where someone was from just by looking at them,
and
the problems that caused in their journeys along the way.
You had prejudices based off of that. Everyone had prejudices based off of that. Again, one of the things that makes
these were homogeneous societies, being forced to interact for a greater good despite their prejudices. In fact, some prejudices so big that they were constantly killing each other 24/7. So
in the face of this greater looming threat, which is one of the things that made Game of Thrones so appealing, and why I think they thought they could. I mean, they have explicitly said that one of the things they were trying to do here is make their own Game of Thrones. It's what Netflix has said about The Witchers. They're trying to have their own Game of Thrones. One of the things that made Game of Thrones so appealing and work so well is because the characters were all flawed, but flawed in ways that weren't caricatures, that made them feel real, even though they were in a fantastical setting.
Well, yeah, when you look at Game of Thrones, Tyrion was a extremely flawed character that continued to do bad things all the way up until the end, but you knew he did it from a good place. He just made bad decisions all the way through. Whereas someone like Littlefinger tried to appear to be good, but he was not a very good person throughout the whole thing. So you develop these different opinions of these people, despite the fact that they had these other issues. But yeah, it just blew me away when they were doing that. And then it's the activism that surrounds it too. It's the idea of, we're going to do this because, and anybody who says anything about it, no matter what your reasons are, you're saying it because you're proof of systemic racism. And that's the ultimate goal behind the whole thing. It's an activist movement, just like CAP was, just like almost all of these movements where DEI is the main goal. We're going to do this because we want that reaction.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, that'll be a fun conversation, and probably a long conversation, because I mean, it's a lot of books.
Yeah. Well, has the series come out yet?
I believe the 19th is when the first episode is released on Amazon Prime.
Okay, so I might not get to watch, because we're gonna have to wait about a week and a half to record our next one, because I'm gonna be in Germany starting Friday to the next day. Well, unless I don't pass my pre-flight COVID test, and then I'll have a lot of time on my hands the next week, being the only one home. But I 100% plan on passing it. But
can't you show them your thick lines? Check out my thick lines, baby.
That doesn't count. That doesn't count. Well, but it's a testament to the fact that they're making everybody test, though, even vaccinated. So I guess technically any of us could pop positive, but it's the testament to the ridiculousness of you're not spreading it if you are.
Is it the airline, or is it getting into Europe?
It's getting into Europe.
Okay.
And then it's a 24-hour turnaround on it too. So I have to do it as close to the flight as I can. So then after that, and then on the COVID note, I do want to talk about the new Pfizer drug, and where the right is way off, saying it's repackaged ivermectin, but also where the fact checkers on the left are way off in that it's nothing like ivermectin. So there are similarities. There's a similar mechanism of action and how that works, but also to take the other extreme view is just going to keeping the fight going versus actually solving anything.
Well, why would we solve anything? That would just be silly. Yeah. All right. Well, then we will see y'all next time.
Yep. See you later.